My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 32 years old. This morning, my phone rang with the call that would change everything. My father's desperate voice cracked through the speaker. "Sarah, I need your kidney. You owe me this much after everything I've done for you." The irony hit me like a freight train. This was the same man who spent 3 decades telling me I was a mistake, that my mother and I never wanted you. Now here he was, literally begging for a piece of me to save his life. I hung up and stared at the medical envelope sitting on my kitchen counter. Inside were kidney compatibility test results he didn't know about yet. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama that will leave you speechless. You won't believe what happens next when family loyalty gets tested in the most twisted way possible. Growing up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, I learned early that love was conditional, and I apparently never met the conditions. Robert Mitchell, my father, had perfected the art of making me feel worthless from the moment I could understand words. While my older brother Jake could do no wrong, everything I touched seemed to disappoint our parents. When Jake brought home C's, Dad would ruffle his hair and say, "Good effort, son." When I brought home straight A's, the response was silence or criticism about how I should focus on being more social instead of burying my nose in books all the time. The comparisons were relentless and brutal. Jake was athletic, so Dad coached his little league team and never missed a game. I was artistic, spending hours drawing and painting, but my artwork was dismissed as a waste of time and money for supplies. When I won the county art contest in 8th grade, Dad's only comment was wondering why I couldn't put that much effort into helping your mother around the house instead. The trophy sat on my dresser, unacknowledged by anyone except me. Christmas mornings were particularly painful. Jake's pile of presents would tower over mine, and when I dared to ask why, Mom would sigh and explain that Jake needed more things because he was more active. Dad would add that maybe if I contributed more to this family instead of being a burden, things might be different. I learned to stop asking questions and started working part-time jobs as soon as I turned 14, desperately trying to prove my worth through financial contribution. The worst memory happened when I was 16. I had been accepted to a summer art program at the state university, full scholarship included, and I was bursting with excitement to tell my parents. I found them in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones, unaware I was listening from the hallway. Dad's voice was clear and cold. "I don't know what we did wrong with Sarah. Sometimes I look at her and wonder what our lives would be like if we had never had her. Jake's got such potential, and then there's her, just taking up space and costing us money." Mom's response was even worse. "Maybe she'll figure out she's not wanted and leave for college early. At least then we could focus on Jake's future." That night, I made a promise to myself. I would excel in school, get a full scholarship, and never need anything from them again. I threw myself into academics with a vengeance, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while working 20 hours a week at the local diner. When college acceptance letters arrived, I had multiple full-ride offers. The day I left for Northwestern University in Chicago was the first time I felt like I could breathe freely. College became my sanctuary. I built meaningful friendships, discovered my passion for marketing, and slowly began to heal from years of emotional wounds. My chosen family of friends showed me what real love and support looked like. After graduation, I landed a position at a prestigious marketing firm in Chicago, working my way up to senior account manager within 5 years. I had created the successful, independent life I had dreamed of during those painful teenage years. For over a decade, I maintained minimal contact with my family. Obligatory holiday cards, brief phone calls on birthdays that lasted less than 5 minutes, and absolutely no visits home. My friends became my family, and Chicago became my home. I dated, traveled, built a career I was proud of, and slowly learned to love myself despite the voices in my head that still echoed my father's cruel words. Therapy helped me understand that their treatment of me said everything about them and nothing about my worth as a person. The distance I had created felt healthy and necessary. I had no desire to subject myself to their toxicity again, and frankly, they seemed perfectly content to pretend I didn't exist. Jake had gotten married to Rebecca, a woman who seemed to share the family's disdain for me based on our few awkward encounters at family gatherings I was guilted into attending. Dad had retired from his job at the grain elevator, and Mom continued her role as the family's chief enabler, always making excuses for Dad's behavior while never standing up for me. Looking back now, I realized those peaceful years of distance were just the calm before the storm. I had built a beautiful life, but I was about to learn that sometimes the past has a way of dragging you back, especially when family members decide they need something from you. The phone call 3 months ago would shatter the protective barriers I had spent years building, forcing me back into a world where my worth was measured only by what I could provide. 3 months ago, my carefully constructed peace was shattered by an unexpected call from Jake. His voice carried an urgency I had never heard before. "Sarah, you need to know that Dad's in kidney failure. The doctors say he needs a transplant soon, or he's not going to make it." The words hit me like ice water, not because I felt immediate grief, but because I knew what was coming next. After years of treating me like I was invisible, suddenly my biological compatibility would make me very visible indeed. Jake continued with barely concealed desperation. "Look, I know things haven't been perfect between you and Dad, but family is family. He's dying, Sarah. Whatever problems you think happened in the past, surely they're not worth letting your father die over." The manipulation was subtle but familiar. The phrase, "problems you think happened," particularly stung, as if decades of emotional abuse were just my imagination or oversensitivity. Against my better judgment, I found myself on a plane back to Cedar Falls 2 weeks later. The small town looked exactly the same, frozen in time like a museum exhibit of my childhood trauma. Driving down Main Street toward the hospital, I passed the diner where I had worked in high school, the library where I had hidden from family dysfunction, and the park where I had sat alone during lunch breaks, wondering why I felt so different from everyone else around me. The hospital room where Dad lay looked sterile and sad. Robert Mitchell, once an imposing figure who could reduce me to tears with a single dismissive look, now appeared fragile and diminished. But the moment I walked through the door, his entire demeanor changed like an actor stepping onto stage. His face lit up with a warmth I had never seen directed toward me. "Sweetheart. You came. I knew you would come through for your old dad." The endearment felt foreign and manipulative coming from his lips. Dr. Amanda Torres, the nephrologist, was a petite woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She explained Dad's condition with clinical precision. "Your father's kidneys are functioning at less than 10% capacity. Without a transplant within the next 6 months, his prognosis is very poor. Family members often make the best donors due to genetic compatibility, and we'd like to test you and your brother to see if either of you might be a match." Jake quickly interjected that he had already been tested and wasn't compatible due to a genetic marker issue. The way he said it felt rehearsed, and I noticed he avoided making eye contact when he delivered this information. "So Sarah's really our best hope," he continued, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "She's always been the strong one in the family." The irony of suddenly being called the strong one by people who had spent years telling me I was weak, worthless, and unwanted was not lost on me. But I agreed to the testing anyway, telling myself that I was doing it to be the bigger person, to prove that I could show compassion even when none had been shown to me. Deep down, I think I was still that little girl desperate for parental approval, hoping that maybe saving Dad's life would finally make me worthy of love. During the 3 days I stayed in town for initial testing, I stayed at Mom and Dad's house for the first time in over a decade. The house felt smaller than I remembered, but the emotional atmosphere was exactly the same. Jake's wife Rebecca was there constantly, playing the role of concerned daughter-in-law while making passive-aggressive comments about how nice it was that I could finally contribute something meaningful to the family. Rebecca had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment. "Oh Sarah, you look so put together. It must be nice having all that time to focus on yourself instead of taking care of family," she would say with a sweet smile. Or, "I'm sure this must be hard for you, being asked to do something selfless for once." The comments were always delivered when others couldn't hear, maintaining her image as the perfect daughter-in-law while subtly undermining my presence. Mom played her familiar role as the family peacekeeper, but her version of peacekeeping had always meant expecting me to absorb everyone else's dysfunction without complaint. "Sarah, "Honey, I know your father can be difficult sometimes, but he's scared. This whole situation has him terrified, and you know how men handle fear. They don't always express themselves well." It was the same excuse-making I had heard my entire childhood, as if Dad's cruelty was just a communication issue rather than a deliberate pattern of emotional abuse. The most disturbing part was how quickly everyone seemed to forget decades of treating me like an unwanted burden. Suddenly, I was being invited to family dinners, asked about my life in Chicago, and included in conversations. Dad would reach over and pat my hand during meals, calling me sweetheart and honey, terms of endearment that felt like a foreign language coming from his mouth. The performance was so transparent it was almost insulting. During one particularly surreal dinner, Dad actually apologized for not being the perfect father, and acknowledged that he might have been too hard on me growing up. But even his apology was conditional and minimizing. "You know how it is, Sarah. I was working long hours trying to provide for this family, and sometimes the stress got to me. But look how strong and independent you turned out. Maybe my tough love worked after all." I wanted to scream that nothing about his treatment had been love, tough or otherwise, but I bit my tongue. I was there for medical testing, not for family therapy or forced reconciliation. I would do what needed to be done and then return to my real life in Chicago, hopefully with the knowledge that I had acted with integrity even when others had not. The testing process itself took several days and involved multiple blood draws, medical imaging, and consultations with various specialists. Dr. Torres was professional and thorough, explaining each step and making sure I understood the risks and benefits of potential donation. What struck me most was how she treated the decision as mine alone, never pressuring me or making assumptions about family obligations. As I sat in various waiting rooms, I had time to reflect on the strangeness of the situation. Here I was, potentially preparing to give a piece of my body to save a man who had spent my entire life making me feel like I didn't deserve to exist. The cosmic irony was almost too much to bear. But I also realized that my decision, whatever it might be, had to be based on who I was, not who he was. I had worked too hard to become a person of integrity to let his failures corrupt my character now. On my fourth night in Cedar Falls, I was staying late at the hospital to review some additional consent forms with Dr. Torres when I realized I had left my phone at my parents' house. I drove back to get it, planning to grab it quickly and return to my hotel room. As I approached the front door, I could hear voices from the living room, and something in their tone made me pause. I found myself standing outside the partially open window, listening to a conversation that would change everything. Jake's voice was clear and excited. "Once she gives you the kidney, we never have to deal with her again. Think about it, Dad, this is perfect. She does this one useful thing, and then we can go back to our normal lives without any guilt about cutting her out. She'll have finally paid her debt to this family." Dad's response was even more chilling. "God, I can't wait for this whole charade to be over. I can't stand pretending to care about that failure. Calling her sweetheart makes me sick, but if that's what it takes to get what we need, I'll keep it up a few more weeks. Jake, you and Rebecca have been perfect through all this. She's lucky we're even giving her the chance to finally contribute something worthwhile." Rebecca's laugh was like nails on a chalkboard. The look on her face when you called her sweetheart at dinner was priceless. "She's so desperate for approval, she'll believe anything. I almost feel sorry for her, but then I remember how she's never done anything for this family. At least now she can serve some purpose." My legs felt weak as I listened to them planning my emotional manipulation with the casual cruelty of people discussing the weather. The fake warmth, the sudden inclusion, the terms of endearment, all of it had been a calculated performance designed to extract what they needed from me. I felt stupid for even briefly hoping that this crisis might have genuinely changed their feelings toward me. Jake continued, "The best part is, after the surgery, if she expects us to have some kind of relationship, we can just tell her that the trauma of Dad's illness has made it too hard to maintain close contact. Or we can blame her for not visiting enough during his recovery. There's always an excuse." I had heard enough. I walked through the front door with deliberately heavy footsteps, making sure they knew I was there. The conversation stopped abruptly, and all three of them turned toward me with guilty expressions that quickly morphed into fake smiles. "Sarah!" Dad exclaimed with forced enthusiasm. "We were just talking about how grateful we are that you're here." "Funny," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Because it sounded like you were talking about something quite different." The room went silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Rebecca's face had gone pale, and Jake looked like a child caught stealing cookies. Jake recovered first, shifting into damage control mode. "Sarah, I think you misunderstood what you heard. We were talking about how worried we are about the whole situation, not anything about you personally." The gaslighting was immediate and predictable. You know how stress makes people say things they don't really mean. Rebecca jumped in to support him. "Honestly, Sarah, you're being paranoid. We're all under tremendous pressure right here, and sometimes when people are scared, they vent in ways that might sound harsh if you only hear part of the conversation. You're reading way too much into this." Dad's approach was different. He stood up slowly, using his illness as a prop, and reached toward me with a trembling hand. "Sweetheart, please don't let fear and stress divide this family when we need each other most. I love you, and I need you. Don't let misunderstandings drive you away when I'm fighting for my life." The manipulation was so blatant it was almost impressive. Within minutes, they had gaslighted me, made me the villain for misunderstanding, and positioned Dad as the victim of my suspicious nature. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, and I realized they had probably been using these same techniques on me my entire life. But something had changed in me during my years away from them. The confident, successful woman I had become in Chicago wasn't the same insecure child who used to accept their version of reality over my own perceptions. I looked each of them in the eye and said quietly, "I know exactly what I heard. I know exactly what you meant. And I know exactly who you really are." I turned and walked toward the door, but Jake's voice stopped me. "Sarah, wait. Where are you going? We need to talk about this rationally." The desperation in his voice was real now, not performed. They were realizing that their plan was falling apart. "I'm going back to my hotel," I replied without turning around. "And I'm going to think very carefully about whether I want to save the life of a man who just admitted he can't stand pretending to care about me." Rebecca's mask slipped completely. "Sarah, you're being selfish and dramatic. This is life or death, and you're throwing a tantrum because your feelings got hurt. Grow up and think about someone besides yourself for once." That comment crystallized everything for me. Even in this moment when they needed something from me desperately, they couldn't resist attacking my character and making me the villain. I realized that no matter what I did, would always be the problem in their eyes. If I donated the kidney, I would finally be useful but still fundamentally unwanted. If I didn't donate it, I would be the selfish daughter who let her father die. As I drove back to the hotel, my mind was racing. Part of me wanted to get on the first flight back to Chicago and never look back. But another part of me, the part that had been shaped by years of therapy and personal growth, wanted to stay and see this through on my own terms. They had shown me exactly who they were, and now I could make my decision with complete clarity about the situation. I also realized that I had one significant advantage. They didn't know what the compatibility test results were yet. Dr. Torres had mentioned that results would be available within a few days, and she would call me directly. Whatever those results revealed, I would be the first to know, and I could decide how and when to share that information. That night, I lay awake in my hotel room, staring at the ceiling and processing the devastating revelation. The family I had always hoped might someday love me had been planning to use me and discard me like a piece of medical equipment. But instead of feeling destroyed by this knowledge, I felt something unexpected, a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I stood with them, and that clarity, however painful, was liberating. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of purpose. Instead of wallowing in the pain of what I had overheard, I decided to take action. If my family could play games and manipulate situations, I could do some investigating of my own. I started in the most logical place, Mom's attic, where she hoarded decades of family documents, photos, and memorabilia. I told Mom I wanted to look through old photo albums to create a memory book for Dad while he was in the hospital. She seemed pleased by this gesture, probably interpreting it as a sign that I was falling back in line with their expectations. She gave me free rein of the attic, saying she was too emotional to go through old memories herself during such a difficult time. The attic was a treasure trove of family history, boxes upon boxes of documents, photographs, and papers dating back decades. I was looking for anything that might give me insight into my family's true feelings about me over the years, perhaps old letters or documents that would provide context for their current behavior. What I found was far more shocking than anything I had expected. In a dusty box labeled "Important Papers," buried beneath mortgage documents and insurance policies, I found a birth certificate with my name on it. But as I examined it more closely, my world began to unravel. The document showed that Robert and Linda Mitchell were not listed as my parents. Instead, the names were David and Margaret Hartley, two people I had never heard of in my entire life. My hands shaking, I dug deeper into the box and found more documents that painted an increasingly clear picture. There were death certificates for David and Margaret Hartley, dated just 6 months after my birth certificate, indicating they had died in a car accident when I was 6 months old. There were social services documents discussing my placement with the Mitchells as emergency foster parents, and most damning of all, there were records of monthly government payments for my care that continued for years. The final piece of the puzzle was a letter from a lawyer's office, dated just before my 18th birthday, asking about my whereabouts and mentioning something about a trust fund that needed to be transferred to me upon reaching adulthood. The letter had never been forwarded to me, of course. It had been hidden away with all the other evidence of who I really was. I sat on the dusty attic floor, surrounded by the debris of 3 decades of lies, trying to process what I had discovered. I wasn't Robert and Linda Mitchell's biological daughter. I was Sarah Hartley, and my real parents had loved me enough to leave me a trust fund before their tragic death. The people I had spent my life trying to please, trying to earn love from, had never been my actual family at all. Suddenly, so many things made sense. Why I never felt like I belonged, why I looked nothing like Jake or my supposed parents, why their treatment of me felt so different from their treatment of Jake. I wasn't their daughter, I was a source of income, a monthly check from the government that helped support their real child while I was treated like an unwanted burden. I photographed every document with my phone, my heart pounding as the full scope of their deception became clear. Then I carefully put everything back exactly as I had found it. They couldn't know that I had discovered the truth, not yet. I needed time to process this information and figure out my next steps. Racing back to my hotel room, I immediately began researching the Hartley family online. What I found broke my heart and filled me with rage simultaneously. David and Margaret Hartley had been young professionals, both 28 when they died. Margaret had been a teacher, David an engineer. Social media posts from friends and relatives described them as loving, excited new parents who were devoted to their baby daughter Sarah. More importantly, I found contact information from Margaret Hartley's sister, my biological Aunt Margaret Hartley Mason, who lived just 2 hours away in Des Moines. According to her Facebook profile, she had never married and had spent her career as a social worker helping children in the foster care system. The irony was overwhelming. That afternoon, Dr. Torres called with my test results. "Sarah," she said, her voice carrying a note of sympathy that made my stomach clench, "I have your compatibility results, and I'm afraid it's not the news your family was hoping for. You're not a compatible donor for your father. The genetic markers just don't match up properly for a safe transplant." I thanked her for the information and asked her not to share the results with my family yet, explaining that I wanted to tell them myself. She agreed, noting that as the patient, I had the right to control how and when my medical information was shared. So there it was, I couldn't save Robert Mitchell's life even if I wanted to, because we weren't actually related. The supreme irony of the situation was almost too much to bear. After 3 decades of telling me I was worthless and unwanted, he was depending on me for his very survival, but biology had made that impossible. That evening, I confronted my mother privately. I showed her the birth certificate and watched the color drain from her face. For a long moment, she just stared at the document, and then she collapsed into a chair and began to cry. But they weren't tears of remorse or guilt. They were tears of fear about being caught. "How did you find this?" she whispered. "We hid all of that so carefully." "Why?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "Why didn't you tell me I was adopted? Why didn't you tell me about my real parents?" Linda's explanation came out in broken sentences between sobs. "We needed the money, Sarah. Jake was expensive, always needing things, and your foster care payments helped us make ends meet. We thought about adopting you officially, but then the payments would have stopped. And you were just a baby, you wouldn't have remembered anyway. But I asked questions as I got older," I said. "I asked why I looked different, why I felt different. You made me feel like something was wrong with me." "We couldn't tell you the truth," she said defensively. "If you had known you were adopted, you might have tried to find your real family. And then what would have happened to us? We had built our whole life around the assumption that you would always be here, always be part of this family." The selfishness of her reasoning was breathtaking. They had stolen my identity, my history, and my inheritance, all to make their lives more comfortable. And they had done it while making me feel grateful that they tolerated my presence in their home. "What about the trust fund?" I asked. "The letter from the lawyer?" Linda's face went completely white. "How did you know about that?" "I found the letter. My real parents left me money, didn't they? And you've been keeping it from me." She nodded miserably. "It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone. We used the money for family expenses, for Jake's college, for things we all needed. We always planned to tell you someday, when the time was right." I left her sitting in her chair, crying and making excuses, and walked back to my hotel. Everything I thought I knew about my life had been a lie. The people who had shaped my childhood, who had made me question my worth and value, had never even been my real family. They had been paid caregivers who had failed spectacularly at providing care while profiting from my existence. But there was one ray of hope in all this darkness. Somewhere out there, I had a biological aunt who might be able to tell me about my real parents, about who I really was and where I came from. For the first time in my life, I had the possibility of connecting with family who had actually chosen to love me, even if I had never known they existed. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting Robert and Jake immediately with what I had learned, I would gather more information and plan my response carefully. They had spent 3 decades manipulating and deceiving me. It was time for me to level the playing field. My first call was to Margaret Hartley Mason, my biological aunt. When I explained who I was, there was a long silence on the phone, followed by what sounded like sobbing. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah, is that really you? I've been looking for you for over 30 years. We arranged to meet that afternoon at a coffee shop in Des Moines." The drive gave me time to process the emotional whiplash of the past 24 hours, from devastating betrayal to the possibility of genuine family connection. When I walked into the coffee shop, I immediately recognized her from her online photos, but more than that, I saw my own features reflected in her face. Margaret was a woman in her early 60s, with graying hair and kind eyes that looked exactly like the ones I saw in my mirror every day. When she saw me, she stood up and just stared for a moment before pulling me into the tightest hug I had ever received. "You look just like your mother," she said through tears. Just exactly like Margaret. Over the next 3 hours, she told me everything the Mitchells had hidden from me. My parents had been deeply in love, married for 2 years before I was born, and absolutely thrilled about my arrival. They had documented every moment of my first 6 months with photos and videos, all of which Margaret had preserved, hoping someday to share them with me. When David and Margaret died in that car accident, my whole world fell apart, Margaret explained. "You were the only piece of them I had left, and the state took you away before I could figure out how to get custody. I was young, single, and working crazy hours as a new social worker. By the time I had my life stable enough to fight for you, you had already been placed with the Mitchells." She showed me photos on her phone, my parents holding me as a baby, my father reading to me, my mother singing lullabies. In every picture, their love was obvious and overwhelming. These people had wanted me, had cherished me, had planned a beautiful future for me that was cut tragically short. I tried to maintain contact with the Mitchells, Margaret continued. I called several times wanting to visit you, to be part of your life even if I couldn't raise you. But they always had excuses. You were sick, you were napping, it wasn't a good time. Eventually, they stopped taking my calls altogether. I hired a lawyer to help me get visitation rights, but the Mitchells claimed I was trying to disrupt a stable placement. The manipulation had started even before I was old enough to remember. They had deliberately isolated me from my real family to maintain complete control over my life and my inheritance. Margaret's voice grew angry as she continued. What made me furious was that they never legally adopted you. If they had genuinely wanted to make you part of their family, they could have done that. But they kept you in foster status to continue receiving payments, which meant I had no legal rights to see you at all. Then she revealed the most devastating piece of information. Sarah, your parents left you a substantial trust fund. At the time of their death, it was worth about $50,000, but it was invested conservatively and has been growing for 32 years. The principal plus interest should be worth well over $200,000 by now. I felt sick. While I had worked part-time jobs throughout high school to buy basic necessities, while I had stressed about college expenses and student loans, while I had struggled to build my career from nothing, there had been money that rightfully belonged to me sitting in accounts I didn't even know existed. The Mitchells have been receiving statements and managing the fund as your guardians, Margaret explained. Legally, they were supposed to turn it over to you when you reached 18, but since you didn't know about it, they just continued controlling it. I've been trying to track the money for years, but without your cooperation or knowledge, there wasn't much I could do. That afternoon, we went together to see Thomas Chen, a family law attorney Margaret had worked with before. He reviewed the documents I had photographed and shook his head in disgust. This is a clear case of fraud and fiduciary abuse. The Mitchells have been stealing from you for over a decade, possibly longer. Thomas explained that we could pursue both criminal charges and civil recovery. The criminal case would be for fraud, identity theft, and theft of funds. The civil case would recover the money plus damages and interest. Given the amount of money involved and the length of time this has been going on, they could face significant prison time. But I wasn't ready to go legal yet. I had a better idea. I want to play their game first, I told Thomas and Margaret. They think they can manipulate me into giving up my kidney to save Robert's life. I want them to continue believing that while I gather more evidence and plan my response. Over the next week, I became an Oscar-worthy actress. I returned to my parents' house and played the role of the dutiful, conflicted daughter trying to make peace with the past for the sake of Dad's health. I recorded conversations using an app on my phone, documented their continued manipulation, and maintained my facade of ignorance about my true identity. The recordings were devastating. Robert continued to complain about having to pretend to give a damn about that worthless girl, while Linda worried about what would happen if I got suspicious about anything. Jake and Rebecca planned their post-kidney future, discussing how they could cut contact with me gradually to avoid looking heartless to mutual acquaintances. Most damning was a conversation between Robert and Jake about the trust fund money. We've got to make sure she never finds out about that money, Robert said. If she discovers we've been using it, she could destroy this whole family financially. The house, Jake's college expenses, Rebecca's car, half of our retirement savings came from that fund. They had been living off my inheritance for years, using money my biological parents had saved for my future to fund their comfortable lifestyle while making me feel like a burden for basic necessities. The level of their betrayal was staggering. Meanwhile, I was building my case methodically. Margaret had connected me with relatives and friends of my biological parents who could testify about their love for me and their financial planning for my future. Thomas was tracking the financial trail of how my trust fund money had been spent over the years. And Dr. Torres had agreed to provide medical testimony about the compatibility testing if needed. The most satisfying part was watching them continue their manipulative performance while knowing that I held all the cards. Every fake smile, every forced term of endearment, every guilt trip about family obligations was being recorded and documented. They were building the case against themselves with every word. Rebecca, in particular, seemed to enjoy her role as the concerned daughter-in-law, pushing me toward donation. She would corner me with tearful speeches about how Robert had finally learned to appreciate me, and how this crisis was bringing the family together. She even suggested that donating my kidney might help me find closure with the past and move forward as a real member of this family. The irony was exquisite. They were trying to manipulate me into saving the life of a man who wasn't actually my father, using guilt about a family I had never actually belonged to, all while stealing money that my real parents had left for me. It was manipulation so layered and complex it was almost impressive. But I had one more card to play, and it was going to be the most devastating of all. They still didn't know about the compatibility test results. As far as they knew, I was still a potential donor who was wrestling with the emotional complexity of the situation. When the time was right, I would reveal that even if I wanted to save Robert Mitchell's life, biology had made it impossible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose 32 years of lies, manipulation, and theft. But this time, I would be the one controlling the narrative, and they would be the ones scrambling to explain themselves. As Robert's condition continued to deteriorate, the family's pressure campaign escalated to levels that were genuinely frightening. What had started as manipulation and guilt-tripping transformed into something much darker and more aggressive. They seemed to sense that their usual tactics weren't working as effectively as they had hoped, so they began deploying increasingly desperate measures. Jake took the lead in what could only be described as a systematic harassment campaign. He called me multiple times a day, sometimes screaming about how I was murdering our father with my selfishness. During one particularly vicious call, he threatened to make sure everyone in Chicago knows what kind of person you really are, if I didn't step up and do what family members are supposed to do. When I pointed out that he wasn't a compatible donor either, his response revealed the depths of their hypocrisy. "That's completely different, Sarah, and you know it. I have a wife and a baby on the way. I have responsibilities and people depending on me. You're just some single career woman with nothing more important to worry about than your own convenience." The baby news was apparently recent, and Rebecca was already using her pregnancy as emotional leverage. She would call me sobbing, claiming that the stress of potentially losing her father-in-law was threatening her pregnancy. "If Robert dies because you're too selfish to help him, and something happens to my baby because of the stress, that blood is on your hands forever," she would say between dramatic sobs. Linda's approach was different but equally manipulative. She had perfected the art of the guilt-laden phone call, usually timed for late evening when my emotional defenses were low. She would start by reminiscing about supposed happy family memories that I knew had never actually happened, painting a picture of a loving family that bore no resemblance to my actual childhood experience. "I keep thinking about that Christmas when you were 12 and you made those little clay ornaments for the tree," she would say, her voice thick with fake nostalgia. "Robert still hangs those on the tree every year. He treasures them, Sarah. He's always treasured everything about you, even if he wasn't good at showing it. Now he's lying in that hospital bed, asking for you, and I don't know what to tell him about why his daughter won't save his life." The manufactured memory was particularly cruel because it was completely false. I had never made clay ornaments for the family Christmas tree. In fact, one year I had tried to make handmade gifts for everyone, and Robert had criticized them as cheap-looking and suggested I should have just bought something normal instead. But the family's manipulation campaign extended far beyond personal phone calls. They began involving extended family members, church friends, and longtime community connections in their guilt campaign. Suddenly, I was receiving calls from great-aunts I hadn't spoken to in years, family friends who barely knew me, and even the pastor from the church the family attended sporadically. Pastor Wilson's call was particularly manipulative. He began by expressing concern for my spiritual well-being and suggesting that I might need counseling to deal with the anger and resentment that was preventing me from showing Christian love to my dying father. When I tried to explain that the situation was more complicated than he understood, he interrupted me with a lecture about forgiveness and honoring thy father and mother. "Sarah, I've known your family for many years, and I know your father isn't perfect," Pastor Wilson said in his practice counselor voice. "But none of us are perfect. The Lord calls us to forgive others as we have been forgiven, and right now, your father needs your help." What kind of person would you be if you let pride and old hurts prevent you from saving a man's life? The most devastating part of the community pressure campaign was how it began affecting my professional reputation. Someone, and I suspected Rebecca, had started calling my workplace in Chicago with anonymous complaints about my character. My boss, Jennifer Walsh, called me during my extended time in Iowa to ask about concerning information that had been reported about me. "Sarah, I've gotten 3 separate calls this week from people claiming to be former clients or colleagues who say you're unreliable and have integrity issues," Jennifer explained. "I've worked with you for 5 years, and this doesn't sound like the person I know, but I have to ask what's going on." I had to carefully explain the family situation without going into all the details about adoption and stolen money. Jennifer was sympathetic, but I could tell that the anonymous campaign was creating doubts about my professionalism and reliability. The family was literally trying to destroy my livelihood to force me into compliance. The local media attention was even worse. Someone had contacted the Cedar Falls newspaper with a story about a heartless daughter who was refusing to donate a kidney to her dying father. The article didn't name me specifically, but in a town the size of Cedar Falls, everyone knew exactly who they were talking about. The reporter had clearly only interviewed family members and hadn't bothered to get my side of the story. Walking through town became an exercise in public shaming. Former teachers would stop me on the street to express their disappointment in how I was handling my family obligations. Store clerks who had known me in high school would make pointed comments about how some people forget where they came from when they move to big cities. The barista at the local coffee shop actually refused to serve me, saying she couldn't in good conscience take money from someone who was letting their father die. The social media campaign was equally brutal. Rebecca had apparently started a whisper campaign on Facebook, posting vague status updates about praying for family members who have lost their way, and asking for prayers for Robert's health while hinting darkly about family members who were choosing selfishness over love. Her friends began sharing these posts and adding their own comments about the importance of family loyalty. Jake escalated to direct threats during one phone call. "Sarah, if Dad dies because you're being stubborn, I will spend the rest of my life making sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. I'll contact every client you've ever worked with, every friend you have on social media, every romantic relationship you've ever had. I'll make sure your selfishness follows you everywhere." The threats weren't idle. I began receiving friend requests on social media from fake accounts that were clearly being used to gather information about my personal life. Someone had started calling my apartment building in Chicago, asking the doorman questions about my lifestyle and visitors. My Chicago friends started getting strange calls from people claiming to be conducting character reference checks for unspecified purposes. The psychological pressure was intense and relentless. They were using every tool at their disposal to break me down: family guilt, community shame, religious manipulation, professional sabotage, and direct threats. It was a coordinated campaign designed to make my life unbearable until I gave them what they wanted. But what they didn't realize was that every threat, every manipulation, every aggressive tactic was actually strengthening my resolve. Their desperation was revealing the true depths of their selfishness and cruelty. A family that genuinely loved me would never have resorted to these tactics, even in a life-or-death situation. They were proving, over and over again, that I had never been family to them, just a resource to be exploited. More importantly, I was documenting everything. Every threatening phone call, every manipulative conversation, every piece of community pressure was being recorded and saved. Thomas Chen had advised me to keep detailed records of their harassment campaign, as it would be relevant to both the criminal case and the civil lawsuit we were planning. The family had chosen to go to war with me, not realizing that I was now armed with information they couldn't imagine. They thought they were breaking me down, but they were actually building the case for their own destruction. Every cruel word, every manipulative gesture, every threat was going to come back to haunt them when I finally revealed what I knew about the adoption, the stolen money, and the medical impossibility of what they were demanding. During the worst of the family's harassment campaign, I found unexpected allies who would help me uncover the full scope of their deception. Dr. Amanda Torres was the first to notice that something was seriously wrong with the family dynamic. During one of my follow-up appointments, she observed the way Jake and Rebecca spoke to me and about me, and her professional concern was obvious. "Sarah," Dr. Torres said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that anything you tell me is confidential. Are you feeling pressured or threatened regarding this potential donation? Because I've seen families handle medical crises in unhealthy ways, and some of the dynamics I'm observing here are concerning." I broke down and told her everything, at least everything I felt comfortable sharing at that point. I explained about the emotional abuse throughout my childhood, the conversation I had overheard about their plans to discard me after the donation, and the escalating harassment campaign. I didn't mention the adoption or stolen money yet, as I was still building that case with Thomas Chen. Dr. Torres listened with growing anger and disgust. "Sarah, what you're describing is coercion, and it's absolutely unethical for me to proceed with any donation process under these circumstances. But there's something else you need to know about your father's condition, something that might give you some perspective on this whole situation." She pulled out Robert's medical file and showed me information that the family had been carefully hiding. "Your father's kidney failure isn't just from natural causes or bad luck. His medical history shows decades of alcohol abuse, which he's consistently lied about to his family and medical providers. The liver damage we're seeing is consistent with someone who's been drinking heavily for years." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Robert had always claimed to be a social drinker who maybe had a beer or two on weekends. He had actually lectured me about the dangers of alcohol when I was in high school, warning me about how drinking could ruin my life and my future. But according to his medical records, he had been a closet alcoholic for decades, slowly destroying his organs while presenting himself as a moral authority to his family. "Dr. Torres," I said slowly, "does Jake know about the alcohol abuse?" She shook her head. "The family has been told about the kidney failure, but your father specifically requested that we not discuss the underlying causes with them. He signed papers making you his medical proxy for certain decisions, which means you have the right to access his full medical history." That was another manipulation I hadn't even been aware of. Somehow, Robert had made me his medical proxy without my knowledge or consent, probably during one of the hospital visits when I was disoriented by the emotional chaos of the situation. It meant I had legal rights to information about his condition that he was keeping from his own son. Meanwhile, Thomas Chen's financial investigation was revealing layers of fraud I hadn't even imagined. The trust fund theft was just the beginning. "Sarah," he explained during one of our meetings, "the Mitchells have been running a sophisticated financial fraud scheme using your identity for over a decade." The details were staggering. They had opened credit cards in my name when I turned 18, using my social security number and their address. They had taken out student loans for my education that had never actually been used for my schooling. They had even received several insurance payouts over the years for various claims involving family medical expenses that had been fraudulent. The total amount of money they've stolen from you, including the trust fund, fraudulent loans, and various other schemes, is probably close to $300,000, Thomas explained. This isn't just a case of family members mismanaging money. This is organized financial crime spanning more than a decade. Margaret, my biological aunt, had been conducting her own investigation into the Mitchells' background. What she discovered explained a lot about why they had been so eager to take me in as a foster child and so reluctant to let me go. "Sarah, I think you need to know that you weren't the Mitchells' first foster child," she told me during one of our regular phone calls. She had found records indicating that the Mitchells had fostered 3 other children before me, all of whom had been removed from their home by social services for various reasons. One child had been returned to a biological relative after reports of neglect. Another had been moved to a different home after allegations of emotional abuse. A third had aged out of the system and disappeared without a trace. The pattern seems to be that they take in children who come with significant financial benefits, whether from the state or from inheritances or insurance settlements, Margaret explained. You were particularly attractive to them because of the trust fund and the ongoing monthly payments. This revelation led to even more disturbing discoveries. Thomas had hired a private investigator to look into the disappeared foster child, a boy named Marcus who had lived with the Mitchells for 4 years before I arrived. The investigator found Marcus living in California, working construction and struggling with addiction and mental health issues that he traced back to his time with the Mitchells. When contacted, Marcus was initially reluctant to talk, but when he learned that someone was finally investigating the Mitchells, he opened up about his experiences. His story was heartbreakingly similar to mine: years of emotional abuse, being made to feel worthless and unwanted, being told he should be grateful for their generosity in taking him in. They destroyed my self-worth so completely that I spent years believing I deserved to be treated badly, Marcus told me during a phone call that left both of us in tears. It took me until my 30s to realize that what they did to me wasn't normal, wasn't deserved, and wasn't my fault. Marcus also revealed that the Mitchells had been receiving Social Security benefits on his behalf after his mother died, money that was supposed to be saved for him but that he never received. His story provided crucial evidence that the fraud and abuse I had experienced was part of a larger pattern of exploiting vulnerable children. But perhaps the most important ally I gained during this period was Janet Caldwell, my former high school English teacher. Mrs. Caldwell had always been kind to me during those difficult teenage years, and she reached out after hearing about the family situation through the community gossip network. "Sarah, I need to tell you something that I've regretted not saying for 15 years, Mrs. Caldwell said when she called me. "I suspected that something was wrong in your home life when you were my student. You were obviously intelligent and capable, but you seemed so sad and anxious all the time. I should have reported my concerns to social services, but I didn't have concrete evidence, and I was afraid of making things worse for you." She went on to explain that she had kept detailed notes about her observations of my behavior and appearance during high school, documenting signs of emotional distress that she now recognized as indicators of abuse. She still had those notes and was willing to provide them as evidence of the long-term pattern of mistreatment. Mrs. Caldwell also revealed something that stunned me. "Sarah, I need you to know that your foster care payments stopped when you turned 18, but your father kept telling people that you were costing them money for college and living expenses. He actually asked several community members for financial help to support your education, money that I don't think ever went to you. Even after I had left for college on scholarship, never asking them for a penny, Robert had continued to use me as a source of income by soliciting donations from well-meaning community members who thought they were helping with my education costs. The fraud was even more extensive than we had realized. Jake's complicity in the financial crimes was also becoming clear. Bank records showed that he had been helping to move money from the trust fund into accounts that he and Rebecca controlled. The down payment for their house had come partially from my stolen inheritance. Rebecca's car had been purchased with my money. Even their wedding had been partially funded by money that rightfully belonged to me. "The evidence is overwhelming," Thomas told me as we reviewed the growing file of documentation. "We have enough to pursue serious criminal charges against all three of them. Robert and Linda will face charges for foster care fraud, identity theft, and grand theft. Jake will face charges for conspiracy and money laundering. If convicted, they could each face several years in prison. But I still wasn't ready to go public with the legal case. I wanted to confront them first, to see their faces when they realized that their victim had become their prosecutor. They had spent so much energy trying to manipulate me into saving Robert's life, not knowing that I held the power to destroy all of their lives instead. The irony was perfect. They thought they were the puppet masters controlling a desperate situation, but I had become the one pulling all the strings. Every conversation, every threat, every manipulation was being documented and would be used against them. Their desperation to get my kidney was blinding them to the much larger danger I represented to their freedom and financial security. By the 8th week of this nightmare, Robert's condition had worsened significantly, and the family's desperation had reached a fever pitch. They decided to stage what could only be described as a full-scale intervention, enlisting everyone they could find to pressure me into submission. The setting was the hospital conference room, and they had assembled what they clearly considered to be an overwhelming force of moral authority. Pastor Wilson was there, of course, armed with Bible verses about forgiveness and family duty. Jake had brought Rebecca, who was now visibly pregnant and playing up her delicate condition for maximum sympathy. Linda had recruited 2 of her sisters, my supposed great-aunts, who had driven in from out of state specifically to guilt me about my family obligations. Even Mrs. Henderson, an elderly family friend from church, had been wheeled in to provide additional moral pressure. The intervention began with Pastor Wilson taking the lead, his voice heavy with practiced solemnity. "Sarah, we're all here today because we love you and we love your father. Sometimes when we're hurting, when old wounds haven't healed properly, we can lose sight of what's truly important. Your father is dying, and you have the power to save him. We're here to help you find the strength to do what's right." Jake's contribution was more direct and aggressive. "Sarah, I've tried to be patient with you, but enough is enough. Dad doesn't have time for you to work through whatever psychological issues you have about your childhood. You need to stop being selfish and step up like an adult. This family has never asked you for anything before, and now when we need you most, you're failing us." The lie was so blatant it took my breath away. This family had never asked me for anything? They had been stealing from me for over a decade, using my identity to commit fraud, and emotionally abusing me my entire life. But Jake delivered the statement with such conviction that I could see the other people in the room nodding along sympathetically. Rebecca's approach was the most manipulative of all. She placed her hands on her belly and looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, I'm carrying your father's first grandchild. This baby will never get to meet Grandpa unless you help us. I can't understand how you could rob an innocent child of the chance to know their grandfather just because you're angry about things that happened years ago." Linda played the role of the heartbroken mother perfectly. "Sarah, honey, I know we weren't perfect parents. No parent is perfect. But we loved you and we raised you and we gave you everything we could. Now your father is dying, and you're the only person who can save him. How can you live with yourself if you let him die out of spite?" Great Aunt Martha, whom I barely remembered from my childhood, delivered what was clearly a prepared speech. "Young lady, I've known this family for 40 years, and I've never seen a father more devoted to his children than Robert Mitchell. He worked himself to the bone to provide for you and Jake, and he never complained about the sacrifices he had to make. Now you have the chance to give back just a little bit of what he gave you, and you're being stubborn and ungrateful." Mrs. Henderson, the elderly family friend, spoke in a quavering voice that was clearly designed to pull on my heartstrings. "Dear, I remember when you were just a little girl, and your father would bring you to church events. He was so proud of you, always talking about how smart you were and how much potential you had. He may not have been good at showing his feelings, but that man loves you with all his heart. Don't let pride destroy your family." The entire performance was simultaneously impressive and nauseating. They had coordinated their stories, prepared their emotional appeals, and assembled their supporting cast with the precision of a military operation. Every person in that room was looking at me with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust, clearly convinced that I was a selfish monster who was letting her father die over petty grievances. Pastor Wilson moved in for what was clearly intended to be the killing blow. "Sarah, I want you to pray with us. I want you to ask God to soften your heart and help you find the strength to forgive. The Lord teaches us that we must honor our father and mother, and right now, the best way to honor your father is to give him the gift of life." That's when I decided I had heard enough. I stood up slowly, looking around the room at all the faces staring at me expectantly, waiting for me to break down and agree to their demands. Instead, I smiled and said, "You know what? You're absolutely right. It's time for me to stop keeping secrets and start being completely honest with everyone in this room." The relief on their faces was obvious. They thought they had finally broken me down, that their intervention had worked. Jake actually smiled and reached over to squeeze Rebecca's hand, probably thinking about how they could finally stop pretending to care about me once they got what they needed. "The truth is," I continued, my voice steady and clear, "I've been lying to all of you for weeks now. I got the compatibility test results weeks ago, and I've been keeping them secret because I wanted to see how far you would go with this charade." The room went completely silent. Pastor Wilson looked confused, Linda's face had gone pale, and Jake was staring at me with growing alarm. The results show that I'm not a compatible donor for Robert Mitchell. Even if I wanted to donate my kidney to save his life, which I absolutely do not, it would be medically impossible because we don't have compatible tissue types. The silence stretched on as they processed what I had just said. Finally, Linda whispered, "What do you mean you're not compatible? You're his daughter." I laughed, and the sound seemed to echo off the conference room walls. "No, Linda, I'm not his daughter. I'm not your daughter either. My name is Sarah Hartley, and my real parents died when I was 6 months old. You and Robert took me in as a foster child because you needed the monthly government payments, and you've been lying to me about it my entire life." The explosion of voices was immediate. Jake was shouting that I was being ridiculous and making things up. Rebecca was crying and claiming that I was having some kind of breakdown. Linda was trying to deny everything while simultaneously looking like she might faint, and Pastor Wilson was calling for calm and trying to restore order. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app, playing back some of the conversations I had captured over the past weeks. Robert's voice filled the room. "God, I can't wait for this whole charade to be over. I can't stand pretending to care about that failure." The room fell silent again as they heard their own words played back to them. I continued playing recordings, Jake talking about how they could cut contact with me after the surgery, Rebecca laughing about how desperate I was for approval, Linda admitting that they had only taken me in for the money. "But wait," I said, my voice dripping with false sweetness, "there's more. Not only did you lie about being my family, not only did you emotionally abuse me for 32 years while collecting government money for taking care of me, but you also stole my inheritance." I pulled out copies of the trust fund documents that Thomas had prepared. "My real parents left me a trust fund that's now worth over $200,000. You've been managing it as my guardians, and using the money for your own expenses. Jake, your college education was paid for with my money. Rebecca, your car was bought with my money. Your house down payment came from my trust fund." Jake's face had gone from pale to bright red. "Sarah, you're having some kind of mental breakdown. This is insane. You need help." "What I need," I said, standing up and gathering my papers, "is for all of you to understand that your lives are about to change dramatically. I've hired an attorney, and we're filing both criminal and civil cases against you. Robert and Linda will be charged with foster care fraud, identity theft, and grand theft. Jake, you'll be charged with conspiracy and money laundering." I turned to Pastor Wilson and the assembled family friends, "And all of you need to understand that you've been manipulated by these people just like I was. They've been lying about who I am and what my relationship to them actually is, all while stealing money and committing fraud." Rebecca tried one last desperate manipulation. "Sarah, even if all of that is true, Robert is still dying. Are you really going to let him die just to get revenge?" I looked at her with genuine pity. "Rebecca, Robert is dying because he's been a closet alcoholic for decades, slowly destroying his organs while lying to everyone about his drinking. Dar. Torres can confirm that. And even if he weren't dying from his own poor choices, I couldn't save him because we're not genetically related." The truth was finally out in all its devastating completeness. 32 years of lies, manipulation, and abuse had been exposed in one brutal conversation. The people who had spent my entire life making me feel worthless and unwanted were now facing the consequences of their actions. Pastor Wilson looked stunned and confused. "Sarah, if what you're saying is true, then I owe you a profound apology. I had no idea about any of this background." "None of you did," I replied. "Because they're very good at presenting themselves as the victims while actually being the perpetrators. But that ends today." I walked toward the door, then turned back for one final statement. "By the way, Jake, I've already contacted Marcus Williams, the foster child who lived with your parents before me. He's prepared to testify about the pattern of abuse and financial exploitation. This isn't just about me. This is about decades of victimizing vulnerable children for profit." As I left the conference room, I could hear the chaos erupting behind me. Voices were raised, accusations were flying, and the careful facade the Mitchells had maintained for decades was crumbling in real time. Their intervention had backfired spectacularly, turning into the very confession and exposure they had been trying to avoid. The aftermath of that confrontation moved swiftly and decisively. Within 48 hours, Thomas Chen had filed both criminal complaints and civil lawsuits against Robert, Linda, and Jake Mitchell. The story broke in the local newspaper first, then was picked up by regional media outlets, and within a week had gone viral on social media platforms across the country. The public response was overwhelming and largely supportive. My story resonated with thousands of people who had experienced family manipulation, financial abuse, or adoption-related trauma. Messages poured in from strangers sharing their own stories of family betrayal and expressing admiration for my courage in standing up to my abusers. Many people donated to a legal defense fund that Margaret had set up to help cover the costs of the complex litigation. The criminal investigation moved faster than anyone expected. The financial evidence was so clear and extensive that Robert, Linda, and Jake were arrested within 2 weeks of the charges being filed. The district attorney's office treated it as a high-priority case because of the systematic nature of the fraud and the vulnerable victim status that my childhood foster care situation had created. Robert's arrest was particularly dramatic because he was still hospitalized. The sight of him being handcuffed to his hospital bed while facing charges for stealing from the foster child he had abused made for powerful television footage that further galvanized public opinion in my favor. His condition had deteriorated to the point where he was on dialysis while awaiting a kidney donor who might never come. Linda's arrest happened at the family home, where she had been hiding from reporters and community members who were demanding answers about the decades of deception. She broke down completely when the police arrived, sobbing and claiming that she had only done what Robert told her to do. Her attorney later tried to present her as another victim of Robert's manipulation, but the financial records showed her active participation in managing my stolen trust fund. Jake's arrest was the most satisfying for me personally. He was taken into custody at his workplace, where several co-workers witnessed his perp walk. The man who had threatened to destroy my reputation was now facing federal charges for money laundering and conspiracy. Rebecca, who was not charged criminally but named in the civil suit, was forced to move back in with her parents when they couldn't make their mortgage payments without access to my trust fund money. The financial recovery process was complex but ultimately successful. Thomas was able to trace virtually every dollar of my stolen inheritance, including money that had been invested in stocks and real estate. With interest and penalties, the total recovery amount exceeded $300,000. The Mitchells were forced to liquidate assets including their house, cars, and retirement accounts to pay restitution. But the most meaningful part of the aftermath was reconnecting with my biological family and learning about my real heritage. Margaret had preserved photo albums, home videos, and personal belongings of my parents that she shared with me over many emotional sessions. For the first time in my life, I could see where my artistic talents, my love of reading, and my stubborn streak had come from. My biological father, David Hartley, had been an engineer who loved building things and solving complex problems. My mother, Margaret Hartley, had been an elementary school teacher who was passionate about helping children learn and grow. They had been married for 3 years before I was born, and every photo and video showed them absolutely delighting in being my parents during those precious 6 months we had together. Margaret, my aunt, became the family I had always craved. She was warm, supportive, and genuinely interested in my life and my feelings. She introduced me to cousins and extended family members who welcomed me with open arms, treating me like the long-lost family member I actually was rather than the burden the Mitchells had always made me feel like. Dr. Torres remained a supportive ally throughout the legal process, providing expert testimony about the medical impossibility of the kidney donation and the coercive family dynamics she had observed. She also helped me understand the medical aspects of Robert's condition, confirming that his kidney failure was indeed primarily caused by decades of alcohol abuse that he had hidden from his family. The trial process took nearly a year, but the outcome was everything Thomas had predicted. Robert received a 6-year prison sentence for fraud and theft, though his failing health meant he would likely serve much of it in a medical facility. Linda received 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 2 years if she cooperated with restitution payments. Jake received 3 years plus 5 years of probation, and his career in finance was effectively destroyed by the felony convictions. Rebecca divorced Jake while he was serving his sentence, taking their daughter and moving across the country to start fresh without the stigma of the Mitchell family name. She had been forced to repay her portion of the stolen money, which included selling her car and jewelry and moving back in with her parents during the legal proceedings. Perhaps most importantly, my story inspired changes in the foster care system oversight in Iowa. The case highlighted gaps in financial monitoring that had allowed the Mitchells to exploit multiple children over many years. New regulations were implemented requiring more rigorous auditing of trust funds and inheritance accounts managed by foster parents. Marcus, the previous foster child, found healing through participating in the legal case. His testimony was crucial in establishing the pattern of abuse, and the publicity around the case helped him connect with other survivors of similar situations. He used some of the media attention to start a support group for adults who had been abused in foster care situations. Mrs. Caldwell, my former teacher, became an advocate for better training for educators to recognize signs of foster care abuse. She worked with the state education department to develop protocols for teachers to report concerns about children in foster placements, hoping to prevent other children from suffering as Marcus and I had. As for me, the experience changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. The financial recovery allowed me to pay off my student loans, invest in my future, and even donate a significant portion to organizations that support foster children and adoption-related causes. I used some of the money to establish a scholarship fund in my biological parents' names for children who had aged out of foster care. My career flourished after the case was resolved. The publicity, while initially overwhelming, ultimately opened doors for me professionally. I was invited to speak at conferences about overcoming family trauma and was offered a position at a larger marketing firm in Chicago with a substantial salary increase and more creative freedom. But the most profound change was internal. For the first time in my life, I understood that the voice in my head that had always told me I wasn't good enough, wasn't wanted, wasn't worthy of love, had never been my voice at all. It had been their voice, implanted through years of systematic emotional abuse. Learning to silence that voice and replace it with self-compassion and genuine self-worth was the hardest but most important work I had ever done. My 33rd birthday was the first birthday I had ever celebrated surrounded by people who genuinely loved me and wanted to be there. Margaret had organized a